So welcome here to Delhi, India, where we are at the third day of the Raisina Dialogue, a very exciting conference here in India. My name is Thomas Myrup, and I'm Facebook's head of EU Affairs. I'm very happy to be able to have this conversation today with Carl Bildt. Carl Bildt is, as many of you know, the former Prime Minister of Sweden. He's the former Foreign Minister of Sweden. He's been active on issues in internet governance for quite a few years now, and has always been a very strong voice for the value of the internet, but obviously also of what needs to be done for us all to get the most out of the internet. So Carl, I'm very excited to have you here today. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
Thank you.
In Delhi, yeah.
Yeah, what do you think of the conference so far?
Oh, I love it, but I've been associated with it for a number of years. It's turned really into one of the great global gatherings of thought leaders and thinkers and policymakers. We have a virtual avalanche of foreign ministers from all over the world. We have tech people from all over the world. We have a lot of young people. I just met a young member of parliament from Lithuania, for example. So it's and a lot of Indians, needless to say, as well.
That's great.
So it's great.
And obviously it's a conference that talks about the geopolitical situation, talked about climate, but technology obviously also played quite a role here. And that's a good thing, right? It's good that we talk about that issue at that high level of the other geopolitical issues.
I think it's absolutely essential. And ORF, which organizes Raisina Dialogue, has been quite active on the discussion about sort of technology implications of geopolitics and geopolitical implications of technology. So that interface between technology and all of the other issues has been fairly high up on the ORF agenda for quite a number of years, and that's reflected in the Raisina as well.
That's great. But tell me one thing, Carl. I mean, normally you would say prime ministers, foreign ministers. How did technology become an issue for you, something that you have spent so much time on? Usually those type of people deal with, war and peace and tanks and big issues. And why technology? How did you get to become interested in this issue?
You have to deal with those policies as well, be that housing policy, agricultural subsidies, or whatever it is. I mean, all of that. But for me, it was fairly obvious from the beginning that technology was going to change a lot, that we were in the beginning of a technological and scientific revolution. With the internet and telecommunication technologies and those sorts of things. And that was going to be profoundly revolutionary in a number of ways which we could not see at that particular time. So it was obvious and essential, I thought, for any policy maker trying to look ahead to take a very deep look at the technology issues and try to understand where we were heading. And it's been quite a journey in the last few decades.
It certainly has, but you were, I think it's fair to say, one of the early birds in this area that saw quickly how important this would become. And I cannot help but having to mention that story of you being the first person to send an email, I think, to another head of state. Isn't that right?
Yeah, or head of government. I was head of state. I said, I was head of government and I sent to Bill Clinton. It's quite a funny story because at the time in the US they were talking quite a lot about information superhighways and things like that, and I had other reasons to deal with President Clinton. So I said, well, let's send an email to the guy. To the White House address. So we did. And this was in '93 or something like that. So it was not that easy, but it was done. And then absolutely nothing happened. And we waited and waited and waited. And after a while, my staff had to call the White House and say, do you have a server for email or whatever? And eventually they did find it. And eventually they sent an email back. And that was the first ever email exchange on that particular level. Well, it's in the museum.
Sure it is. A lot more emails has been sent since then. And people have expectations that you answer. So a lot of work for many of us there. But maybe turning a little bit more to today and how things are now, and maybe also zooming a little bit in on Europe, where both of us are from. And if you look at Europe today and thinking about technology, what are the biggest sort of issues that are facing us in Europe when it comes to internet governance and getting the most out of technology? What do you see as being the key challenges that we have?
The key challenges have been are the competitiveness of Europe. We have, in every sort of way that we measure it, we have a lot of talent in Europe when it comes to be that artificial intelligence, or be that blockchain, or be that whatever. You find that talent at the universities and research institutions. Where we are lacking somewhat is that we need to fund them better, so that the risk of them otherwise sort of migrating to the US or migrating somewhere else where there's more money available for the talent that wants to do daring things. We need to have better capital markets so that the startups that we have, and we have very, very impressive startups, that they don't force to go to other parts of the world in order to get the capitals. And we need to work more with what we call the digital single market in Europe. We are 28, soon 27 countries when the UK go their own way, but I think they will be part of this in a digital sense anyhow. But of course we need to integrate our markets more in order to be competitive. So these things need to be done.
Right.
And then being aware of the digital dimension that is there to virtually every other issue that we deal with, be that the green transition or the taxation issues or whatever it could be.
Right. So if you were to say on a scale from 0 to 100, how far are we with the digital single market? How close are we to being there?
We are, I mean, we have established the free flow of
data?
Non-personal data. I think that's sort of a fifth freedom, which is immensely important. We still have an element of data localization legislation hovering around. We need to integrate our capital markets more. But in the pure data digital market, I think we are 70, 80, not too bad.
Okay, it's not too bad. But Europe really needs that home market to be more successful in tech.
We need the home market. We need to be better at funding research and development. We need to be better at developing our capital markets. So it's very much a question of the entrepreneurial culture. We got the talent, we got the ideas, we got the guys who are doing things, but they need to have better conditions.
Are Europeans willing to take risk? Are we willing to take risk and do what it takes to be a startup?
Less than the Americans. That's one of our problems. I mean, Americans, there's been a fear of failure culture in Europe. An American entrepreneur, he can go bust X numbers of times, but then he succeeds. A European entrepreneur doesn't like to go bust, go into liquidation. There's still a stigma associated with that. We need to get away from that and have a somewhat more entrepreneurial culture. We have it to some extent, but we need to move further in that direction.
Right. So if we sort of move to another issue than sort of the entrepreneurial part of it, there's also all the issues around democracy, digital democracy, dealing with all these issues online, and it's been a huge issue for a company like Facebook. We have invested a lot in our aim to deal with these issues. And, where do you see the situation going? There's obvious responsibility on companies like ours to do our part, and we're trying very hard to do that. Are there responsibilities on governments, politicians, others as well? Are there things that they need to do in this area?
It's an evolving space, because I mean, had you and I talked about these issues 5 years ago, they would hardly be an awareness of it. Now there's a big issue, and companies like Facebook and others are doing what they can in order to get a better hold on it. There's discussion whether one needs legislation. I don't think one does, but I mean the discussion is there. I think there's a need of awareness. Of course, in this world of ours, there's an avalanche of information available to anyone. And we need to better educate the coming generations in order to be able to handle this, to understand that there are good things, a lot of good things out there that you can access, but there was also evil and less good things, and there are less bad, less good actors.
So digital literacy essentially being...
Digital literacy and literacy in general terms. I mean, better education levels to be able to handle this world of much easier access to all sorts of information that we're living in, a much better situation that we had before, needless to say.
Right. I think we at Facebook feels that in some areas actually there isn't enough regulation, and we've actually asked for regulation in certain areas, and one of those areas is the area of political advertising, where we think that the rules aren't maybe as clear as they could be online. Do you think they are? Do you think that actually we could do more to make it clearer how you can use the digital space also for political campaigning?
The problem is that those sorts of issues are regulated somewhat differently in different countries. For example, in my country, Sweden, we have no rules whatever. I mean, in a political campaign, a political party can say whatever they want. We have limits on television advertising in campaigns. and that has to do with sort of financial issues, really. But it's very difficult to see that you can regulate the free speech that has to be there of a democratic society. There could be aspects of it, how much you can spend, how much you can do, how much you
transparency
can
rules,
transparency rules, and so that you declare what you do and things like that. But to limit what is said, I think that's difficult. And there should be sort of an openness on what you say. If you have sort of hidden, clandestine, targeted measures to certain groups, and you are not declaring them to others, or making information about them available to sort of more
transparency again, essentially.
Quite.
What is it you're doing?
I think that is the most important thing, because then if bad things are done, then bad things will be done. They will be exposed.
You will be called on it,
Yeah,
right. So moving maybe the questions beyond Europe and sort of to Europe's role in the world. You know, Europe is in some ways seen as sort of being a leader in digital legislation, and GDPR, for example, I think has made its mark in the world as being something that others are looking at and thinking about what they can take from that and use where they are. How do you see Europe's role in sort of internet governance and the geopolitical situation around digital at this moment?
We've been fairly successful on some regulatory things. I mean, go back, we now have a big discussion on 5G, for example. Should not forget that sort of 4G and 3G was really sort of an example of European regulation and European standard setting. It wasn't that in the beginning, but the European standard became the global standard. And we'll see what happens with 5G now. You mentioned privacy. Yeah, privacy is an issue of concern to Europeans, somewhat more than in the US perhaps, and distinctly more than in China. And that has led to GDPR. Is that a perfect piece of legislation? No, it's not, but it's a first try to get something that is decent when it comes to privacy legislation in this digital world of ours. So I think in that particular respect, the European unions have been trying to take the lead in the global debate, and a lot of people are looking at it and see if they can follow part of that example.
Right, but you have, maybe you can say that there are like three poles. There's an American pole, which is a little
on the privacy issues, yeah.
Well, more generally, sort of a little bit more laissez-faire, maybe, and there's a European one that deals with sort of we need regulation, and maybe there's a Chinese model as well.
Well, there is. But the big difference is, of course, that the Chinese model, they would everything ultimately be controlled by the state.
Right.
While the Americans and we Europeans say, no, that can't be done. I mean, the state has a role in any sort of free society, but society has a role, what we call the multi-stakeholder approach.
Right.
So there the Americans and the Europeans are on the same page.
A lot more in common.
Then, of course, we tend to be somewhat more setting standards and having some limits to it than was generally accepted in the US. But whether that will be like that 10 years from now remains to be seen. We'll see.
Carl Bildt, thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.